I still remember the night they laughed. My parents sat across the dinner table smirking as I spoke with trembling hands about opening a small cafe down. My mother chuckled and said I'd last maybe 3 months before begging for a real job. My father looked over his glasses, muttered something about foolish dreams, and told me I'd never make a living selling lattes. That night, I went to bed numb, but not broken. Their words echoed louder than my heartbeat, and for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to earn their approval. I started building my own, years later. As I stood inside my flagship cafe, the one now valued at over $42 million, I watched them walk in. They didn't come to apologize. They came with loyalty cards in their hands, asking for free coffee. Before we go deep into this story, tell me, where are you watching from? When I was 23, I still lived in the same house I grew up in. A house filled with the scent of burnt coffee, cigarette smoke, and judgment. My parents weren't cruel in the obvious ways. They didn't scream or hit. They belittled quietly through sighs, rolled eyes, and backhanded compliments. My mother was a corporate perfectionist who wore ambition like perfume, and my father was a numbers man, rigid, proud, and allergic to anything that didn't promise immediate profit. I, on the other hand, loved the smell of roasted beans, the sound of milk steaming, and the comfort of strangers talking over coffee. I didn't crave wealth, I craved warmth. But in my family, dreams that didn't come with a business plan were considered embarrassing. It started small. A notebook full of ideas, a list of potential names for my CFA hand-drawn logos on napkins. I used to sneak out early in the morning, walking to a small bakery near the station, studying how the owner greeted customers by name. It fascinated me, how something so simple, a cup of coffee, could create community. When I told my parents I wanted to create that same feeling, they exchanged glances that cut deeper than any insult. My mother sighed and said, "You've always been a dreamer, but dreams don't pay bills." My father laughed and added, "People like you end up broke or baristas. You should be grateful we paid for your degree." At first, I tried to reason with them. I showed them market research, cafe concepts, potential investors, but all they saw was failure waiting to happen. They reminded me daily that success meant corporate titles, stock portfolios, and family reputation, not coffee cups and croissants. Every conversation became a battle. My mother started introducing me to real professionals at dinner parties, men with suits and no smiles, all eager to remind me that creative people like me usually end up working for people like them. I could have stayed and kept pretending, but something inside me snapped after my father said one night, "You'll never make more than the cost of the beans you buy." I remember leaving the table, walking out into the night air, and realizing that their approval had become a prison. That same week, I took a part-time job at a local cafe, not because I needed the money, but because I needed to learn. The owner, a kind woman named Elena, became my first mentor. She taught me everything: how to roast beans, design a menu, negotiate supplier costs, even how to read people's moods from the way they ordered their drinks. She believed in me when no one else did. For 2 years, I worked double shifts, days at Elena's cafe, nights, building my dream. I sketched layouts on napkins, researched property prices, and slowly saved every cent I could. My parents thought I was wasting time. They said, "It's a hobby, not a career." But hobbies don't make you cry from exhaustion at 3 a.m. while designing your first cafe layout on the floor of a rented apartment. Then came the day I told them I was quitting my office job. My mother's fork dropped onto her plate. My father didn't even look up. He said, "You'll be crawling back within 6 months." I didn't argue. I just smiled and said, "We'll see." Because deep down, I already knew. I wasn't chasing their permission anymore. I was chasing my freedom. That was the night I signed the lease for a tiny, rundown storefront on Willow Street. It smelled like mold and dust. But to me, it smelled like potential. I named it the Ember Room. Because even the smallest spark can start a fire. The day I received the keys to that broken little cafe, I felt equal parts terror and triumph. The walls were cracked, the floorboards uneven, and the ceiling leaked whenever it rained. But I saw something my parents never could: possibility. The neighborhood wasn't glamorous. It was the kind of forgotten corner where time moved slowly, where old bookshops still clung to life, beside pawn stores and dollar markets. Yet, it was alive. People here talked to each other, shared stories, laughed loudly, and didn't care who was watching. I wanted my cafe to feel like that. A refuge for ordinary souls who needed warmth, not judgment. The first few weeks were brutal. I had barely enough savings to repaint the walls and replace the counters. I did most of it myself, watching tutorials late into the night, covered in paint and sweat. I couldn't afford professional help, so I bartered. A carpenter named Theo agreed to fix the tables in exchange for free coffee for 6 months. A college artist painted the logo on the window in return for sandwiches and tips. I built a community before I even opened the doors, and for the first time I realized something powerful. While my parents built wealth, I was building belonging. When I finally opened the Ember Room, I expected a quiet launch. Instead, I woke up to a line down the street. Word had spread from the locals I'd befriended. They came to support the girl who refused to give up. The first customer handed me a crumpled $10 bill and said, "I heard your coffee's made with stubbornness." I smiled and told him, "Then it's perfectly brewed." That day, I sold out of everything before noon, but success, even in its infancy, attracts resentment. A few weeks later, my parents visited unannounced. They walked in like critics, entering a play they already hated. My mother glanced around, unimpressed. "So, this is it?" she asked, brushing a speck of dust off her coat. My father smirked. "Enjoy it while it lasts. People get bored quickly." I stood behind the counter, wearing an apron still damp from steamed milk, and simply said, "Maybe. But for now, they're here." They didn't buy anything. They just looked around, whispered, and left. That was their way of saying, I'd never be enough. The months that followed were a test of endurance. Rent was high, utilities higher, and I barely scraped by. I lived on day-old pastries and caffeine. There were nights I slept in the back office, crying silently, so no one would hear. Every mistake felt fatal. But every morning, I opened those doors again. I cleaned, brewed, smiled, and tried. Slowly, faces became familiar. Students came to study, couples came to talk, and old men came just to feel less alone. My cafe wasn't just surviving, it was starting to mean something. Then came the betrayal I never saw coming. Elena, the woman who'd once mentored me, opened a cafe 2 blocks away. At first, I thought it was a coincidence until I saw her menu. Every drink, every pastry, every detail mirrored mine. My recipes, my signature lattes, even the same rustic cups I'd ordered from a small supplier overseas. I felt sick. I confronted her, but she said business was business. "You learned from me," she said coldly. "Now it's time to see who can actually make it." For weeks, her cafe stole my customers. Her location was newer, cleaner, and she had investors backing her. I had no one. Every day felt like drowning slowly, one empty seat at a time. My parents called around then, pretending to check in. My mother said, "Maybe this is a sign you should come home." My father added, "We told you. Dreams don't pay bills." That night, I almost gave up. I even drafted a closing notice, but when I stepped outside and saw the dim glow of my cafe's sign flickering against the rain, something inside me burned again. I couldn't let the Ember Room die. Not after everything. I spent the next month reinventing everything. I changed the menu, designed loyalty programs, and hosted small community events, poetry nights, art showcases, and charity fundraisers. I collaborated with local farmers for fresh ingredients and learned digital marketing through free online courses. Slowly, the tide shifted. People started coming back, not just for the coffee, but for the connection. They said my place had a soul. And souls, once found, don't leave easily. Then fate intervened in the most unexpected way. A popular food blogger stumbled into my café one rainy afternoon. She'd missed her train, ordered a cappuccino, and spent an hour watching how we treated customers. The next day, she posted a review titled, "The warmest place in the coldest part of town." Overnight, my café went viral. Local news picked it up, influencers visited, and lines formed around the block again. I was terrified and grateful all at once. Within months, revenue tripled. Elena's café didn't survive the winter. The investors pulled out when they realized her charm was imitation, not authenticity. I never gloated. I just kept working. That's when an angel investor approached me. A woman who'd read about my story and believed in my vision. She offered funding to expand into new locations. I signed the deal with trembling hands, realizing the girl once mocked for dreaming too small had just been given a chance to dream bigger than ever before. I called my parents that night, not to boast, but to share the news. My mother's tone was flat. "That's nice," she said, like she didn't quite believe it. My father asked, "So you're still doing this coffee thing full-time?" I smiled into the phone. "No," I said softly. "I'm building an empire." By the end of that year, the Ember Room had 3 thriving branches, each more beautiful than the last, but success didn't erase the past. Deep down, I still longed for their approval, even though I knew I'd never get it. Yet, as I stood behind the counter one morning, watching strangers share laughter over something I built from nothing, I realized I didn't need it anymore. My validation had been sitting right there, in every smile, every sip, every thank. I had turned their laughter into my foundation, their doubt into my drive. What they once mocked now had a waiting list for franchise opportunities, and as the aroma of roasted beans filled the air, I whispered to myself, "You were right, Dad. Dreams don't pay bills. They buy buildings." The years that followed were a blur of long nights, business meetings, and quiet victories. The Ember Room grew from 3 cafes into a network of 12 locations across the state. Each one carried the same warmth and story, a safe haven for dreamers, misfits, and people who'd been told they weren't enough. The brand became a symbol of perseverance, something larger than coffee. Every store had a wall where customers could write their dreams in chalk, a reminder that ambition doesn't belong to the privileged, it belongs to the persistent. But success, as sweet as it tasted, had a bitter aftertaste. The higher I climbed, the more my parents tried to rewrite history. They began telling relatives they had supported me from the start. They showed up at public events, smiling for cameras they once would have turned away from. At first, I let it go. I told myself they were just trying to save face, but when I overheard my father telling a local reporter that he was the one who guided me toward entrepreneurship, something inside me cracked. The same man who told me coffee dreams were for failures was now taking credit for my empire. Then came the storm I didn't see coming. My parents' company, my father's accounting firm, had started crumbling. It began with whispers in town, clients leaving, unpaid debts. My father had always prided himself on being a man of control, but control is fragile when built on arrogance. By the time the media picked it up, the damage was irreversible. They were bankrupt, drowning in lawsuits and unpaid taxes. I didn't hear it from them, of course. I found out through a headline, "Local accounting firm collapses under investigation." I stared at the photo attached. My parents standing outside a courthouse, their faces drained of color. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow. These were the same people who mocked my dream, who called me naïve, and now they were facing the kind of humiliation I had once lived through. Life, it seemed, had a poetic sense of justice. Weeks passed before they reached out. One afternoon, as I was checking inventory at the flagship store, my assistant handed me a note. It was written in my mother's handwriting. "We need to talk, please." The tone was desperate, a word I never thought I'd associate with them. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet. They arrived late, wearing clothes that looked borrowed and eyes that had lost their shine. My mother's manicured nails were chipped, my father's tie wrinkled. For the first time in my life, they looked human, vulnerable. My father cleared his throat and began, "We're in a difficult situation." His voice trembled on the word, difficult. My mother avoided my gaze. They told me about the lawsuits, the debt, the house they might lose. Every sentence was soaked in fear. Then came the request I knew was coming. My mother said softly, "We were hoping, maybe you could help us, just until things settle down." The air between us turned heavy. I looked at the same people who once laughed at my dream, who told me to grow up, who said passion doesn't pay. And now they were here, asking for the help of the daughter they had ridiculed. My heart pounded, not out of anger, but something deeper. The realization that this was the full circle moment life had been building toward. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I invited them to the café the next morning. "We'll talk there," I said. My father looked confused but nodded. My mother managed a small, hopeful smile. The next day, they walked into the Ember Room for the first time since that awkward visit years ago. The walls gleamed. The scent of espresso hung in the air, and the morning sun spilled across tables, filled with laughter and life. Every corner of the cafe was alive, a living, breathing contradiction to everything they'd ever said I couldn't do. They sat down at a table near the window, the same spot where I once dreamed of seeing them proud of me. I walked over, not in an apron this time, but in a tailored suit. The kind they used to say was only for real business people. I placed 2 cups of coffee on their table. "On the house," I said. My father took a sip and nodded. "Still tastes like stubbornness," he said with a weak smile. My mother laughed softly, though her eyes glistened. "It's good," she whispered. "Better than I expected." Then came the silence, that heavy kind of silence that sits between people who know too much history to speak freely. Finally, my father said, "We need financial help. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." I sat down, folded my hands, and looked at them, not with spite, but with clarity. "Do you remember?" I began slowly. "When you told me I'd never make it, that people like me end up broke, that I should be grateful for scraps instead of chasing something bigger." They both lowered their eyes. I continued, my voice steady but sharp. "You were wrong. And now, you're asking for help from the same dream you tried to destroy." My mother reached across the table, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We're sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "We were wrong. We didn't understand." For a moment, I felt that familiar ache, the daughter who had begged for validation. But it passed quickly. I realized something vital. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reopening the door. Sometimes it means locking it gently and walking away. I told them I would help, but not the way they expected. I offered to hire them at the company, under one condition: they would start at the bottom, learning the business like everyone else. No titles, no special treatment, no family privileges. They looked stunned. My father's pride flickered, but desperation won. He nodded slowly. My mother whispered, "Thank you." The next week, they started working as trainees at the distribution branch. The same people who once scolded me for serving coffee were now learning how it was made, packed, and shipped. I watched from afar, not out of revenge, but reflection. Every bean they bagged, every box they labeled, was a quiet reminder of how fragile arrogance truly is. Over time, something changed in them. The bitterness faded, replaced by humility. My mother began smiling at the staff. My father started asking questions instead of giving orders. And for the first time, I saw gratitude in their eyes, not for money, but for mercy. But poetic justice has its own timing. A month later, the Ember Room was featured on the cover of a national magazine under the headline, "From Mockery to Millions, the Woman Who Turned Doubt into an Empire." I didn't expect the cover to go viral, but it did. Overnight, media outlets were calling and invitations to speak at conferences poured in. The photo showed me standing in front of the flagship Café, holding a cup with the logo shining behind me. When the issue reached the Café, I found a copy left open on one of the tables. My mother had been reading it. The page had a single coffee stain near the title. She looked up at me, eyes wet, and whispered, "You did it. You really did it." I smiled faintly. "Yes," I said, "and now you finally see what belief can build." As I walked back to my office, I realized that life had given me a gift I hadn't asked for. Closure. My parents' apology didn't erase the years of pain, but it healed the silence between us. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. It's about watching them learn the lesson you once begged them to understand. That night, I closed the café alone, standing beneath the warm hum of the lights. The same girl who was once told she'd fail was now the woman who built a $42 million brand, and the same parents who mocked her dream were now learning how to serve it, one cup at a time. The months after the magazine cover were surreal. My world had shifted again. But this time, it was quieter. Not the explosive, overnight kind of change, but the slow realization that peace had finally settled where pain once lived. The Ember Room wasn't just a cafe anymore. It had become a movement. People wrote letters, sharing stories about how they had left toxic families, quit jobs that suffocated them, and started businesses inspired by mine. Every time I read one, I saw a piece of myself in their courage. I started mentoring young women who reminded me of who I used to be, nervous, hopeful, and hungry for something more than survival. I taught them how to start small, how to fail gracefully, how to let people's doubt become the music they work to. One afternoon, after a workshop, a girl handed me a small thank you note. It said, "They called me unrealistic too, but you made me believe dreams are a form of revenge." I cried when I read that, because she was right. Dreams, when realized, are the softest, most powerful form of revenge. They don't humiliate, they illuminate. My parents still worked under the company's wing, not as my subordinates, but as humble employees among hundreds. They learned slowly, awkwardly at first. I didn't interfere. I wanted them to earn their redemption. Over time, I watched small changes bloom. My father, once obsessed with titles and control, started volunteering to train new recruits. My mother began organizing charity events through the company. Their pride transformed into purpose. They no longer walked with arrogance, they walked with awareness. One evening, after closing hours, I found my father sitting alone in the café. He was staring at the chalk wall where customers wrote their dreams. A piece of chalk rested between his fingers. When he saw me, he looked almost shy. "I wanted to add something," he said quietly. I nodded and stepped closer. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were steady. To believe in someone before they prove you wrong. I stood there, speechless, as tears welled in my eyes. That one line, his confession, his apology, his redemption, all written in white chalk. In that moment, I realized that revenge, no matter how justified, fades in comparison to transformation. Watching my parents learn humility was more satisfying than any act of payback. It wasn't about making them suffer. It was about watching them understand. The kind of understanding that life forces upon you when pride finally collapses. As the Ember Room expanded internationally, the media began calling me a self-made success. But I always corrected them. I wasn't self-made, I was pain-made. Every cruel word, every doubt, every dismissal, they all built the walls that held this empire up. I didn't rise in spite of my parents. I rose because they showed me what not to become, and in a strange, bittersweet way, that was its own kind of love. Years later, when my parents finally retired, I bought them a small cottage near the sea. Not out of obligation, but peace. The same parents who once called my dream foolish now spent their mornings drinking the coffee that built their daughter's legacy. Sometimes, when I visited, my mother would hug me tighter than she used to, as if she still feared I might vanish. My father would pour me a cup and say, half joking, "It's on the house this time." I'd smile knowing how much that line meant. There's one memory I hold closest. My first international store opening in Paris. I stood before the crowd, flashlights flickering, and thought about that small rundown Café Willow Street, the one that smelled like dust and desperation. I could almost see my younger self again, kneeling on the floor, scrubbing tiles, whispering, "One day they'll see." And now, they had. When the ribbon was cut and the cameras turned off, I took a moment alone inside the store. I ran my hand over the polished counter, inhaled the familiar scent of roasted beans, and smiled. My journey had started in a house where dreams were ridiculed, and it led me here, to a life built entirely from belief. Not my parents' belief in me, but my belief in myself. That night, I posted a photo on my social media. Me holding a cup of coffee, standing under the sign that read the Ember Room Fay Paris. The caption was simple. They said dreams don't pay bills. They were right. Dreams buy buildings, hearts, and peace. The post went viral, but what mattered more were the comments. Thousands of strangers cheering, crying, sharing their own stories of doubt turned into fire. The world was full of people who'd been told no. I wanted to be the living proof of what happens when you answer that no, with relentless persistence. Years later, during a brand anniversary event, a journalist asked me what I would tell the girl who started all of this. I paused, smiled, and said, I'd tell her that someday, the people who doubted her will drink from the cup she built with her tears, and they'll finally taste the strength she brewed alone. Now, whenever I walk into one of my cafes, I take a moment to sit by the window, the same way my parents once did when they came asking for help. I watch strangers laugh over steaming cups of coffee, and I feel the hum of life that only comes from turning pain into power. And sometimes, I still whisper to myself, not out of anger, but gratitude. Thank you for not believing in me. You gave me the fire I needed to start the Ember Room, because that's the truth no one tells you. Sometimes the ones who mock your dream are the ones who build your foundation. Not by supporting you, but by challenging you so deeply that you're forced to become unstoppable. And as for my parents, they don't ask for free coffee anymore. They still visit quietly, slipping into the crowd like any other customer. They pay full price, sit by the window, and watch me from afar with a pride they no longer have to hide. I let them because forgiveness is not a transaction, it's a freedom you give yourself. Now, every time I see them sitting there, sipping from cups bearing the logo they once dismissed, I smile, because in the end, this isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about resurrection, about a girl who turned ridicule into recognition, who built an empire from ashes, and who finally learned that the sweetest victories aren't shouted, they're sipped slowly, one cup at a time.